Men are not coming back. That single sentence is the conclusion people do not want to hear. The ending that gets ignored, delayed, argued against, or waved away as temporary. But it is a truth that frames everything else in this discussion. And once you understand why that sentence is true, you cannot unsee what is unfolding right now across dating, economics, and modern relationship. This video is about a shift that has already happened, and not one that might happen in the future. It is about money, power, expectations, and consequences in a global economy that is squeezing everyone, and how that pressure has exposed realities that were easy to ignore when times were easier. Stay to the end because the final conclusion is not about blame or victory. It is about permanence. And once a social behavior becomes permanent, it does not reverse just because people are uncomfortable with the outcome. For decades, men were told to step back, stay silent, not approach, not lead, not expect, and not ask. They were told that their presence was a problem, their attention was unwanted, their standards were oppressive, and their role was unnecessary. This message was repeated through culture, media, education, and policy until it became background noise. At the same time, women were told that independence meant freedom from men, that needing nothing was strength, that partnership was optional, and that the old rules no longer applied. For a long time, the system appeared to work, or at least it appeared to work on the surface because the economy was strong enough to hide the cracks. Cheap credit, rising wages, easy jobs, and social safety nets made it possible to believe that the traditional exchange between men and women had become obsolete. That illusion is now collapsing. As the global economy worsens, the cost of living rises, housing becomes unreachable, food prices climb, and financial stress becomes unavoidable. Reality has reasserted itself. Independence is not free. Autonomy has a price. Solitude has consequences. When systems are under pressure, the stories we tell ourselves are tested against what actually works. What we are seeing now is not men suddenly changing their minds, and it is not women suddenly becoming unreasonable. It is a collision between economic reality and social expectations that were built for a very different world. In the past, dating involved an implicit understanding. Men invested time, effort, and resources. Women offered companionship, partnership, and the possibility of building a future together. That arrangement was criticized, dismantled, and reframed as outdated, transactional, or unfair. Men were told that paying was oppressive, that providing was patriarchal, and that leadership was control. Women were told that accepting support was weakness, that reliance was dependency, and that needing a man meant failure. The result was a cultural reset that removed expectations from one side while keeping demands on the other. For years, men adapted. They listened. They withdrew. They learned to keep their distance. They learned to avoid risk. They learned that approaching was dangerous, that rejection was public, and that missteps could carry consequences far beyond embarrassment. They were told to work on themselves, to improve quietly, to stop expecting anything in return. And many of them did exactly that. They focused on careers, on fitness, on hobbies, on peace. They built lives that did not revolve around romantic validation. They discovered that solitude, while not glamorous, was stable, predictable, calm. Now the environment has changed again, but this time the change is not coming from social pressure. It is coming from financial stress. As living costs rise and economic security erodes, many women are facing realities that were postponed rather than eliminated. Rent does not care about ideology. Grocery bills do not respond to slogans. Utility companies do not accept empowerment as payment. When survival becomes more expensive, partnerships regain their practical importance, not as a fantasy, but as a necessity. This is where the tension explodes. Many men are now being asked, implicitly or explicitly, to step back into a role they were told to abandon, but without the respect, appreciation, or authority that traditionally came with it. They are being asked to pay, provide, protect, and stabilize while being told that they should expect nothing, lead nothing, and define nothing. That is not partnership. That is extraction. Men see it clearly, and that is why the resistance is not emotional. It is rational. When men say they are done, they are not being dramatic. They are responding to incentives. Humans follow incentives, not lectures. If effort leads to risk, cost, and blame, while withdrawal leads to peace, stability, and autonomy, the choice becomes obvious. Men did not collectively organize to walk away. They simply followed the logic presented to them. Step back, respect boundaries, do not impose, do not expect, build your own life. That is exactly what happened. The idea that men can simply be called back now misunderstands human behavior. Once someone adapts to a lower level of expectation and finds contentment there, raising the cost again requires offering something of equal or greater value. Many men do not see that offer on the table. What they see instead are higher demands paired with continued hostility toward the very traits that make provision possible. You cannot tell someone they are unnecessary for decades and then act surprised when they do not feel obligated to rescue you. There is also a deeper psychological shift that is being ignored. Men who have spent years alone have recalibrated their emotional baselines. They are no longer operating from scarcity. They no longer feel the urgency to impress, chase, or prove themselves. They have learned that loneliness is survivable, and that lesson changes everything. A person who knows they can survive alone is far more selective about what they allow into their life. They are less willing to tolerate chaos, disrespect, or imbalance. Peace becomes non negotiable. This is why the conversation around money on dates has become so revealing. When women demand financial investment up front while offering little beyond presence, men do not hear romance. They hear risk. They hear an attempt to reassert away an old expectation without restoring the old balance. In a stable economy, this might have been absorbed without much resistance. In a stressed economy, it becomes a deal breaker. Every dollar spent is weighed against effort, value, and outcome. Men are no longer operating from optimism, they are operating from caution. It is important to understand that this is not about punishing women, and it is not about men seeking revenge. It is about adaptation. Systems adapt to incentives, cultures adapt to consequences, individuals adapt to repeated outcomes. When men repeatedly experienced that effort was met with criticism, suspicion, or dismissal, they adjusted their behavior. When women repeatedly experienced that independence insulated them from consequences, they adjusted theirs. Now the economic environment has shifted and the adaptations no longer align. There's also a generational component that cannot be ignored. Younger men grew up watching older men navigate divorce, financial loss, public shaming, and emotional burnout. They saw what happened when relationships failed. They saw the asymmetry of consequences. That observation shaped their risk tolerance long before they ever entered the dating market. Walking away was not a reaction, it was a preventative strategy. At the same time, many women were encouraged to prioritize career, experience, and self fulfillment first, with the assumption that partnership could always be added later. That assumption was built on a stable economy and a surplus of willing men. Both conditions are now eroding. The result is not a moral failure, it is a planning failure. When the environment changes, plans built for the old environment fail. What we are witnessing now is the early stage of a long adjustment period. Social narratives are trying to catch up to economic reality, but narratives move slowly. People cling to stories that validate their past choices, even when those stories no longer serve them. Men are being told that their withdrawal is selfish. Women are being told that their expectations are reasonable. Both messages ignore the underlying issue, which is that the exchange itself is broken. Partnership requires balance, not ideological balance, but practical balance. Effort must be matched, risk must be shared, value must flow both ways. When one side is asked to absorb cost without influence or appreciation, participation declines. That is not bitterness, that is economics. The phrase men are done is often misunderstood as anger. In reality, it is resignation. It is the quiet conclusion reached after years of observation and experience. It is the understanding that the current system offers more downside than upside. Men are not staging protests, they are not demanding change. They are simply opting out. That is far more dangerous to a system than open rebellion because it does not announce itself, it just drains participation. This is why appeals to shame no longer work. Telling men they are failing women does nothing when men no longer define success through female approval. Telling men they owe society does nothing when society has made it clear that their contribution is optional and suspect. Obligation only exists where belonging exists. You cannot sever belonging and then demand obligation. As economic pressure increases, the gap between expectation and reality will widen. More women will feel the strain of rising costs. More men will double down on minimalism and independence. The dating market will continue to fragment with fewer people participating seriously and more people retreating into isolated strategies for survival and comfort. This is not a phase, it is a correction. Some will argue that things will balance out, that people will adjust their expectations, that compromise will return. That is possible, but it requires honesty, humility, and a willingness to reevaluate narratives that have been treated as untouchable. It requires acknowledging that telling men they were the problem had consequences. It requires acknowledging that independence has limits. It requires acknowledging that cooperation cannot be rebuilt on guilt. The uncomfortable truth is that many men have already made their decision. They have structured their lives around not needing romantic partnership. They have found satisfaction in work, routine, and personal freedom. Reversing that requires offering something that genuinely improves their lives, not something that adds complexity and risk. Demands alone will not do that. Nostalgia will not do that. Fear will not do that. As this situation continues to unfold, the narratives will become louder, more emotional, and more accusatory. That is what happens when systems fail. Blame becomes a substitute for adaptation, but blame does not change incentives. Only outcomes do. Men are not coming back simply because the cost of living went up. They will only return if the value proposition changes, and right now, many do not see that happening. This is not a declaration of victory for anyone. It is a description of a stalemate created by years of mismatched messaging and reinforced by economic pressure. The question is not who is right. The question is what happens next when a large portion of the population quietly decides that the game is no longer worth playing. And that is where this conversation really begins. The next stage of the shift is not loud or dramatic, and that is why so many people misunderstand it. Social change is often imagined as protests, slogans, or confrontations, but the most powerful changes happen quietly, through millions of individual decisions that all move in the same direction. Men opting out is not something you see on the news every night. It shows up in empty dating apps, declining marriage rates, shrinking birth numbers, and an increasing number of men who structure their lives around self sufficiency rather than partnership. These are not emotional reactions, they are long term behavioral adjustments. One of the biggest mistakes made in the current discussion is assuming that men are withholding effort as leverage, as if this is a temporary tactic designed to force negotiation. That assumption completely misses the point. Leverage requires desire. Leverage requires an underlying motivation to return to the table. What many men are experiencing now is the absence of that motivation. They are not waiting for better terms. They have mentally closed the chapter. When someone no longer believes the system can work for them, they stop investing energy in reforming it. This becomes clearer when you look at how men talk about time. Time has become the most protected resource. Money can be earned again, energy can be restored. Time once spent is gone. Men who have spent years in low return relationships, confusing dating environments, or emotionally draining situations have learned that guarding their time is not selfish, it is survival. When asked to spend time, effort, and money on dates that feel like auditions with no clear outcome, many men simply decline. Not out of hostility, but out of efficiency. There is also an increasing awareness of asymmetry. In theory, modern dating is supposed to be equal. In practice, the risks are not evenly distributed. Emotional fallout, financial exposure, reputational risk, and legal consequences often fall more heavily on men. That reality has been documented, discussed, and shared widely enough that it now informs behavior at scale. You cannot convince someone to ignore risk once they understand it. You can only reduce the risk or accept that participation will drop. Another overlooked factor is how technology has reshaped expectations. Social media has amplified standards while eroding connection. People are exposed to highlight reels that distort what is normal and what is attainable. This affects both men and women, but it interacts differently with economic stress. When expectations rise while resources shrink, frustration is inevitable. Men are increasingly unwilling to compete in an environment where the goalposts are unclear and constantly moving. They are opting for environments where effort produces predictable results, such as work, training, or skill development. Women, on the other hand, are facing a different form of pressure. Many were told that they could delay partnership indefinitely without cost, that the pool of willing, capable men would remain stable regardless of time or circumstance. That assumption did not account for men adapting. It did not account for men deciding that solitude was preferable to uncertainty. It did not account for the cumulative effect of years of messaging that framed male effort as suspect rather than valuable. As financial pressure mounts, these assumptions are being stress tested. The discomfort that follows is not just about money, it is about expectation collapse. When reality no longer matches the story you were told, the first reaction is disbelief, then anger, then bargaining. Only later comes acceptance. Right now, much of the discourse is stuck in the anger and bargaining phases. Accusations are easier than recalibration. There's also a cultural lag at play. Social narratives do not update at the same speed as economic conditions. Policies, media messages, and educational frameworks are often designed for yesterday's reality. The messages encouraging radical independence were developed during a period of growth and relative stability. They are ill suited for a period of contraction. Cooperation becomes more valuable when resources are scarce, but cooperation cannot be demanded. It must be incentivized. What makes this moment especially fragile is that trust has been eroded on both sides. Men do not trust that their effort will be appreciated or reciprocated. Women do not trust that men will show up consistently or without conditions. Trust, once broken, is slow to rebuild, especially when each side believes the other holds power. Without trust, transactions replace relationships, and transactions are ruthlessly evaluated under economic pressure. This is why the debate over who pays for dates has become symbolic rather than practical. It is not really about the cost of a meal, it is about what that cost represents. For men, paying can feel like stepping back into an obligation that offers no guarantee of respect or continuity. For women, not being paid for can feel like a loss of perceived value or investment. Both interpretations are shaped by past messaging, not present reality. Until that disconnect is addressed, the argument will continue without resolution. Another important element is the changing definition of masculinity. For generations, masculinity was tied to provision, protection, and leadership. Those roles were criticized, deconstructed, and in some cases ridiculed. Men were told to redefine themselves, to be softer, quieter, less assertive. Many did, but those traits are not easily switched on and off. You cannot tell someone that their traditional strengths are liabilities and then expect them to deploy those strengths on demand when circumstances change. Men who have redefined masculinity around autonomy, discipline, and internal validation are not easily drawn back into externally driven roles. They are less responsive to appeals that rely on duty or expectation. Their sense of purpose has shifted inward. That shift is profound and largely irreversible. Once someone stops seeking permission or approval, they do not easily return to that mindset. At the same time, many women are discovering that independence without support can be isolating, especially under economic strain. Independence was sold as empowerment, but empowerment was often defined narrowly as not needing men, rather than as building resilient networks and reciprocal partnerships. Hey guys, in a world pushing you to own nothing and be happy, crypto is your key to survival. Join Angry's Crypto Academy to master buying, selling, and trading crypto. Make huge profits and safeguard your wealth. Plus, discover the one crypto virtually no one is talking about, poised to create new millionaires in the upcoming bull run. The link is in the description of the video below. Go check it out now. As those networks fail to materialize at scale, the burden becomes individual. Individual burdens feel heavier when shared solutions are absent. This leads to a painful realization for many people. Systems that discourage cooperation eventually run out of surplus. When everyone is told to look out for themselves, the collective capacity to absorb shocks diminishes. Men walking away is not just a dating issue, it is a signal that social cohesion has weakened. When half the population disengages from traditional roles without new ones replacing them, instability increases. There is also a demographic dimension that cannot be ignored. Lower partnership rates lead to lower birth rates. Lower birth rates lead to aging populations. Aging populations strain social systems that rely on younger workers. These are not abstract projections. They are measurable trends already unfolding in many countries. The decision of individual men to opt out aggregates into structural consequences. Yet, despite these realities, much of the conversation remains focused on moral judgments rather than practical solutions. Men are framed as immature or afraid. Women are framed as entitled or unrealistic. These character based explanations avoid the harder truth, which is that incentives shape behavior more than ideology ever could. If the current environment discourages cooperation, cooperation will decline, regardless of how much people argue about fairness. One of the most telling signs of this shift is how rarely men now talk about changing the system. In the past, dissatisfaction often came with demands for reform. Now it comes with silence. Silence is not apathy, it is withdrawal. It signals that engagement is no longer seen as worthwhile. When people stop arguing, it is often because they have stopped caring about the outcome. This creates a feedback loop. As men disengage, women experience fewer positive interactions, which reinforces negative expectations. As women express frustration, men see confirmation that withdrawal was the right choice. Each side interprets the other's behavior through a lens shaped by past disappointments. Without deliberate effort to break the cycle, it intensifies on its own. The economic context amplifies everything. When resources are scarce, tolerance drops. People become less patient, less forgiving, less willing to experiment. Dating, which already involves uncertainty, becomes a luxury many feel they cannot afford. Emotional energy is conserved. Risk is minimized. Familiar routines replace exploration. It is also worth noting that not all men are walking away, just as not all women are struggling. But trends are driven by margins, not averages. A relatively small but growing percentage of men opting out is enough to change the dynamics of the entire market. Scarcity shifts leverage, expectations recalibrate, often painfully. The uncomfortable implication is that some outcomes cannot be negotiated away. If a large number of men decide that solitude offers a better quality of life than modern relationships, no amount of messaging will reverse that without structural change. Structural change takes time. In the meantime, individuals must navigate the reality as it is, not as they wish it to be. This moment forces a reconsideration of what partnership actually means, not as an ideological statement, but as a functional arrangement between two people under real world constraints. Partnership that ignores economic reality collapses. Partnership that ignores emotional reality collapses. Sustainable partnership requires alignment between effort, reward, and respect. Right now, that alignment is missing for many men. They are being asked to give more while trusting less. From a purely rational standpoint, that is an unattractive proposition. Until that changes, withdrawal will continue. Not because men are angry, but because they are done pretending that sacrifice without reciprocity is noble. As this adjustment continues, some people will adapt. Expectations will soften. Roles will be renegotiated quietly. On an individual level, away from public debate, others will not adapt and will experience increasing frustration. Social systems do not protect against that, they simply reflect it. The key point is that this is not a temporary mood, it is the result of long term conditioning intersecting with economic pressure. Men listened when they were told to step aside. They learned to live without being needed. That lesson, once learned, does not easily fade. As this pattern deepens, the conversation shifts from individual choices to collective consequences, even if most people involved never consciously intend to shape society at large. Social systems are often altered by accumulation rather than design. When enough individuals make similar decisions for similar reasons, the aggregate effect becomes unavoidable. Men stepping back from dating, marriage, and long term partnership is not a coordinated movement, but it functions like one because the underlying incentives are widely shared. That is why attempts to personalize the issue miss the mark. This is not about a few bitter individuals. It is about broad behavioral alignment under pressure. One of the most revealing aspects of this moment is how quickly language has changed. Words like standards, boundaries, and self care are now used by men in ways that would have been unthinkable a generation ago. These terms were once associated almost exclusively with women. Men adopting them signals a deeper shift in self perception. When men begin to articulate their own limits without apology, it indicates that they no longer see sacrifice as a default virtue. That change alone reshapes the dating landscape more than any argument ever could. There is also a growing divide between public expectations and private behavior. Publicly, many men still express openness to partnership, still claim they would like a relationship under the right conditions. Privately, their actions tell a different story. They swipe less, approach less, invest less emotionally early on, and disengage more quickly at the first sign of imbalance. This is not hypocrisy, it is risk management. Public discourse lags behind private adaptation because admitting withdrawal invites criticism, silence is safer. Women, meanwhile, are navigating their own internal conflicts. Many genuinely want connection, stability, and shared effort, but they are operating within narratives that discourage vulnerability and compromise. Admitting the need for partnership can feel like admitting failure under a framework that equates independence with worth. This creates a tension between desire and identity. When economic stress intensifies that tension, it becomes emotionally exhausting. Frustration grows, but the tools to resolve it are limited by ideology. This is where storytelling becomes dangerous. When people are told that a group is morally obligated to behave a certain way, but that group does not feel morally invested in the outcome, resentment replaces persuasion. Men are increasingly resistant to moral framing because they have watched moral arguments shift whenever convenient. What was praised one decade was condemned the next. Consistency builds trust. Inconsistency erodes it. Another factor driving disengagement is predictability. Men are gravitating toward systems where inputs reliably produce outputs. Careers, fitness, skills, and routines offer that predictability. Dating does not. The more unpredictable dating becomes, the less attractive it is compared to alternatives. This is not unique to men, but men appear more willing to abandon unpredictability entirely rather than attempt to manage it socially. That willingness reflects confidence in self sufficiency. There is also a legal and institutional backdrop that influences behavior even when it is not discussed openly. Family law, custody norms, and financial obligations shape risk calculations long before relationships begin. Men do not need to experience negative outcomes personally to learn from others. Observational learning is powerful. When cautionary tales circulate widely, behavior shifts preemptively. Ignoring that reality does not make it disappear. As men withdraw, the meaning of effort changes. Small gestures that once carried significance are now scrutinized for return on investment. This does not mean romance is dead. It means romance is being evaluated through a lens shaped by scarcity and experience. Idealism fades faster under pressure, pragmatism rises. One of the ironies of the current moment is that many of the qualities women say they want in men, stability, emotional control, independence, discipline, are precisely the qualities that make men comfortable being alone. A man who has his life structured, his finances controlled, and his emotions regulated does not experience loneliness the same way someone dependent on external validation does. Asking that man to disrupt his equilibrium requires a compelling reason. Without one, inertia wins. This creates a paradox. The more men improve themselves to meet modern expectations, the less incentive they have to participate in systems that do not clearly enhance their lives. Improvement was supposed to make men better partners. In many cases, it has made them content non participants. That outcome was not anticipated, but it follows logically. At the same time, economic instability narrows the margin for error. When budgets are tight, mistakes hurt more. Choosing the wrong partner becomes costlier. Recovery takes longer. That reality encourages conservatism in personal decisions. Men who might have been willing to take chances in a forgiving economy become cautious in a harsh one. This is not pessimism, it is adaptation. Cultural institutions have been slow to respond because they are invested in preserving narratives rather than outcomes. Media continues to promote images of effortless romance and abundance that feel increasingly disconnected from lived experience. That disconnect breeds cynicism. When stories do not match reality, people stop believing the stories, not reality. Another overlooked aspect is the erosion of informal social spaces. Many traditional venues for organic interaction have disappeared or been stigmatized. Workplaces are cautious, social groups are fragmented. Online spaces dominate, but they compress human interaction into shallow exchanges. Men who are uncomfortable navigating these environments simply opt out rather than force themselves into roles that feel unnatural or risky. As participation declines, those who remain often encounter a more transactional environment. With fewer people willing to invest deeply, interactions become more strategic. This further discourages idealistic participants, accelerating withdrawal. It is a classic downward spiral driven by rational responses to changing conditions. The long term implication is a redefinition of adulthood. For generations, adulthood was marked by partnership, family, and shared responsibility. Increasingly, adulthood is being redefined as autonomy, self maintenance, and minimal obligation. This redefinition aligns with economic uncertainty, but conflicts with social expectations built on older models. That conflict creates confusion and anxiety, especially for those whose identities are tied to the old markers. Men are not immune to that anxiety, but many have resolved it by simplifying their lives. Fewer commitments mean fewer points of failure. Simplicity becomes a form of control. In uncertain times, control is valuable. Relationships, by definition, require surrendering some control. Without trust, that surrender feels reckless, and women face a different calculus. Many still value relational depth and shared life building, but they encounter a shrinking pool of men willing to engage on those terms. This mismatch is not resolved by criticism, it is resolved by alignment. Alignment requires concessions from both sides, not declarations from one. There is also an emotional fatigue that rarely gets acknowledged. Years of debate, accusation, and defensiveness wear people down. Men who once cared deeply about being understood now often prefer being left alone. Emotional detachment becomes protective. Once that detachment sets in, rekindling engagement is difficult. This is why appeals to nostalgia fall flat. Reminding men of how things used to be ignores the reason those things changed. You cannot restore an old system without addressing the forces that dismantled it. Pretending those forces never existed insults the intelligence of people who lived through them. As this transition continues, new microcultures will emerge. Small communities with shared values will form quietly. People will self select into environments that reflect their priorities. Broad consensus will become rarer. Fragmentation will increase. That fragmentation is not inherently negative, but it does signal the end of one size fits all narratives. The central misunderstanding remains the same. Many believe men are waiting to be convinced. They are not. They have already decided what works for them under current conditions. Changing that decision requires changing conditions, not changing rhetoric. Until effort is met with respect, risk with reciprocity, and contribution with appreciation, withdrawal remains the rational choice. This is not a condemnation of women, nor is it a celebration of isolation. It is an acknowledgement of cause and effect. When cooperation is framed as optional for one side and obligatory for the other, imbalance follows. When imbalance persists, participation declines. The path forward, if one exists, will not be found through blame or denial. It will be found through quiet, individual level recalibration. People adjusting expectations, redefining roles, and choosing honesty over ideology. That process is slow and uneven. Many will struggle along the way. What is clear is that the era of automatic male participation is over. Men are not default providers waiting to be activated. They are individuals making calculated choices in a constrained environment. Ignoring that reality does not change it. The question now is not whether men will come back, but whether the structures that once depended on their participation will adapt to their absence. And as the absence becomes more visible, institutions and commentators begin to search for explanations that do not challenge their foundational assumptions. It is easier to say men are confused, immature, or influenced by bad ideas than to admit that a long chain of incentives produce predictable outcomes. Societies rarely like admitting that their messaging worked exactly as delivered. Men were told they were optional. Many accepted that assessment and reorganized their lives accordingly. Calling that outcome a failure of men avoids confronting the success of the instruction itself. What is happening now exposes a fundamental misunderstanding about motivation. Obligation only functions when there is a shared sense of belonging. When men felt needed, valued, and respected, obligation felt natural rather than imposed. When that sense was replaced with suspicion and critique, obligation lost its emotional foundation. You cannot sustain duty on resentment. Once duty collapses, participation becomes conditional, and conditions are judged pragmatically rather than morally. Another shift worth examining is how conflict is processed. In earlier eras, friction between men and women was handled privately within families, communities, and social circles. Today, conflict is broadcast, amplified, and monetized. Every disagreement becomes content, every grievance becomes a trend. This constant exposure intensifies perception of risk. Men observing public disputes conclude that privacy and discretion are endangered commodities. the safest option becomes disengagement. Economic strain sharpens this instinct. When resources are tight, mistakes feel catastrophic. A relationship that might have been tolerable during abundance becomes unacceptable during scarcity. This recalibration is not about generosity versus selfishness. It is about survival psychology. People protect what they have when replacement is uncertain. For many men, peace has become the most valuable asset they own. There is also a subtle but important difference between loneliness and solitude that rarely gets acknowledged. Loneliness is the pain of unwanted isolation. Solitude is chosen distance that brings clarity. Many men have crossed that line. What once felt like loneliness transformed into solitude once they stopped expecting fulfillment from relationships that constantly disappointed them. Solitude, once embraced, is difficult to give up. It is predictable. It does not argue. It does not escalate. It does not demand explanation. This psychological shift explains why appeals to empathy often fail. Men are not lacking empathy, they have simply redirected it inward. After years of being told to examine themselves, question themselves, and improve themselves, many have done exactly that. The result is not greater submission, it is greater self focus. When empathy is not reciprocated, it is eventually withdrawn. Meanwhile, many women are grappling with a contradiction they were never prepared to resolve. They were told they could demand everything and sacrifice nothing, that standards were strength and compromise was surrender. In an abundant environment, that posture appeared sustainable. In a constrained environment, it becomes isolating. The shock comes from discovering that leverage depends on alternatives. When alternatives diminish, leverage fades, regardless of how justified one believes their expectations are. This is where economic reality becomes impossible to ignore. High living costs compress options. People delay milestones. Risk tolerance drops. Social experimentation slows. The dating market does not exist outside these forces, it is embedded within them. Pretending otherwise leads to frustration rather than solutions. Another underdiscussed factor is the rise of individualized fulfillment. Men increasingly derive meaning from personal projects that do not require negotiation. Building something tangible, mastering a skill, maintaining physical health, or cultivating a routine offers immediate feedback and a sense of progress. Relationships, by contrast, often feel like negotiations with unclear objectives. When progress is ambiguous, motivation declines. This preference for clarity extends to expectations. Men are more willing to invest when roles, boundaries, and outcomes are explicit. Ambiguity breeds hesitation. Many modern dating norms celebrate ambiguity as freedom, but freedom without structure often produces anxiety. Men are opting out not because they fear commitment, but because they dislike undefined commitment where responsibility exists without authority. Authority is a sensitive word, but its absence matters. Responsibility without authority is a recipe for burnout. Being accountable for outcomes you cannot influence is psychologically draining. Men have learned this lesson in workplaces, institutions, and relationships. They are applying it consistently. If influence is limited, investment follows. As withdrawal continues, the market adapts in uneven ways. Some women lower expectations, others double down. Some men re enter selectively. Others entrench further. There is no uniform response. What is uniform is the end of assumption. Nothing is automatic anymore. Every interaction is evaluated. Every expectation is questioned. That alone marks a fundamental shift. There is also a generational echo effect. Younger men observe older men who opted out and appear stable, while older men observe younger men refusing paths they once felt pressured into. This cross generational reinforcement normalizes withdrawal. Once a behavior is normalized, stigma loses power. Without stigma, persuasion weakens. Attempts to reverse this trend often rely on moral urgency. Arguments about societal collapse, declining birth rates, or cultural decay are deployed to pressure men into re engagement. These arguments misunderstand tend to individual incentives. People do not sacrifice personal well being for abstract futures unless they feel connected to that future. When belonging erodes, appeals to collective responsibility ring hollow. Another miscalculation is assuming that economic pain will automatically push men back into relationships for survival. That assumption overlooks how adaptable minimalism can be. Many men have reduced their needs rather than increased their dependencies. Smaller living spaces, fewer expenses, simpler routines. When expectations shrink, pressure loses leverage. Independence becomes resilient, not fragile. Women face a different constraint. Biological timelines, social expectations, and safety concerns create pressures that minimalism does not fully relieve. This asymmetry fuels frustration, but frustration does not create attraction or cooperation. It creates noise. Noise obscures solutions. One of the most difficult truths to accept is that no one is coming to fix this at scale. Governments cannot mandate attraction. Media cannot restore trust. Institutions cannot manufacture desire. Change will occur only through millions of private decisions adjusting slowly to new realities. Some people will find alignment now, others will not. The dating market will likely polarize further. High compatibility pairs will form and disengage from discourse. Low compatibility participants will circulate longer, growing more frustrated. This polarization will be interpreted as moral failure rather than structural consequence. That interpretation will delay adaptation. Men who remain open to partnership increasingly seek environments where values are explicit and expectations are shared up front. They avoid spaces that prioritize performance over sincerity. This selectivity reduces volume but increases clarity. Fewer relationships, but potentially more stable ones. That outcome benefits those who adapt, but it does not restore the old norm. The broader social implication is a cooling of intimacy as a default expectation. Intimacy becomes conditional, earned, and rare rather than assumed. That shift affects not just romance, but friendship, community, and trust more broadly. When people guard themselves, connection slows. And despite this, there is an opportunity embedded in the disruption. Honest renegotiation is possible when illusions collapse, but honesty requires acknowledging uncomfortable facts. It requires admitting that messaging had unintended effects. It requires recognizing that autonomy and cooperation are not opposites, but complements that must be balanced deliberately. For now, balance is absent. Men are conserving, women are recalibrating. Both are reacting to forces larger than individual intention. The economy tightens, expectations collide, silence grows. What remains constant is cause and effect. When participation costs more than it offers, participation declines. When peace is easier to maintain alone than together, solitude wins. This is not ideology. It is arithmetic applied to human behavior. The coming years will test whether adaptation can occur without resentment hardening into permanent separation. That outcome is not predetermined, but time matters. The longer distrust persists, the more habits solidify. Habits, once solidified, define culture more than debate ever will. Men are not waiting to be convinced, they are living the lives they were told to build. If those lives no longer include partnership, it is because partnership failed to present itself as an improvement rather than a liability. As habits solidify, the gap between expectation and reality becomes more emotionally charged, not because people are unaware of what is happening, but because they are unsure how to respond without abandoning deeply held beliefs. When a worldview promises fulfillment and delivers strain instead, the mind looks for external explanations before it questions the framework itself. This is why the discussion increasingly circles around personality flaws, generational weakness, or moral decline. These explanations protect ideology while avoiding structural accountability. One of the most significant developments in this phase is the reclassification of effort. Effort used to be seen as a prerequisite for reward. Now, effort is treated as a cost that must be justified in advance. Men, in particular, are unwilling to front load investment without clear indicators of reciprocity. This is not stinginess. It is a recalibration shaped by repeated experiences where effort was interpreted as entitlement rather than contribution. When contribution is reframed as something suspect, contributors retreat. This retreat is often misinterpreted as emotional avoidance, but it is more accurately described as strategic detachment. Strategic detachment does not mean a lack of feeling, it means feeling is no longer allowed to dictate behavior. Men who once operated on hope now operate on pattern recognition. Patterns are unforgiving teachers. Once a pattern is identified, ignoring it feels irresponsible. Women navigating a different set of pressures are experiencing the cost of delayed interdependence. Many were told that reliance was a trap and that strength meant standing alone indefinitely. That message underestimated how much of modern life quietly assumes shared load bearing. Rent, childcare, emotional labor, and long term planning are easier when distributed. When distribution does not occur, the individual carries everything. Under economic contraction, that weight becomes visible. The emotional friction emerges when these realities collide with identity. Identity, built on independence, struggles to integrate need without shame. Identity built on self sufficiency struggles to integrate vulnerability without fear. Both sides face internal resistance to adaptation. That resistance slows resolution and increases frustration. Another layer shaping behavior is the erosion of social forgiveness. Mistakes that once led to learning now lead to exclusion. Public accountability cultures amplify error and minimize growth. Men observing this environment conclude that the margin for error in relationships is too narrow. When a single misstep can redefine someone permanently, caution becomes default. Reduced participation follows. The decline of informal courtship rituals also matters. Shared scripts once guided interaction. Those scripts have been dismantled without replacement. Ambiguity was celebrated as liberation, but ambiguity without shared norms increases anxiety. Men who prefer clarity and predictability withdraw rather than guess incorrectly. Guessing wrong feels dangerous in an environment that interprets mistakes as character flaws. As norms fragment, microagreements replace shared expectations. Individual couples negotiate terms privately, but the absence of common ground makes entry harder. Negotiation requires trust and communication skills that are rarely developed in high conflict discourse. Many simply opt out rather than negotiate under stress. Economic contraction reinforces all of this. When future outlook is uncertain, long term commitments feel risky. Men who do not trust the stability of institutions are reluctant to bind themselves to arrangements that assume institutional fairness. This skepticism is not ideological, it is observational. When outcomes appear inconsistent, confidence declines. One consequence of this skepticism is the rise of parallel lifestyles. Men invest in health, savings, and hobbies that offer tangible returns. They build routines that minimize dependency. These routines are not empty. They are structured, disciplined, and satisfying in a quiet way. The satisfaction is not explosive, but it is durable. Durability matters under pressure. Women, meanwhile, face a narrowing window for partnership under conditions that discourage it. This creates a sense of urgency that collides with men's desire for caution. Urgency and caution rarely align. The mismatch intensifies misunderstanding. Each side interprets the other's behavior through their own lens, often inaccurately. The media response to this mismatch often worsens it. Simplified narratives reduce complex incentives to moral judgments. Men are framed as avoiding responsibility. Women are framed as unrealistic. These frames generate engagement, not understanding. Engagement driven by outrage crowds out nuance. Nuance is necessary for adaptation. Another factor influencing withdrawal is the perceived instability of modern relationships. Serial dating, ambiguous exclusivity, and shifting expectations make continuity feel fragile. Men who value continuity prefer environments where it is reinforced. When continuity is not culturally supported, opting out feels safer than constant renegotiation. There is also a revaluation of legacy. For some men, legacy used to mean family. Now, legacy is increasingly defined as personal integrity, financial stability, and freedom from regret. That shift reflects diminished trust in systems that once rewarded sacrifice with continuity. When legacy is internalized, external validation loses power. This internalization is often mistaken for apathy. It is not. It is prioritization. People prioritize what they believe they can protect. When trust in external systems declines, internal systems gain importance. Men are building lives they can control because control reduces anxiety. Relationships, by contrast, introduce variables that feel increasingly unmanaged. Women are not blind to this shift, but many struggle to respond without compromising identity. Adjusting expectations can feel like surrender rather than strategy. This framing traps people in stasis. Change becomes emotionally costly even when it is practically beneficial. The result is a stalemate where each side waits for the other to move first. Waiting prolongs discomfort but avoids immediate identity conflict. Over time, waiting becomes the norm. Norms solidify into culture. This cultural hardening affects how younger generations enter adulthood. They observe disengagement as a valid option rather than a failure. When opting out is normalized, social pressure weakens. Without pressure, incentives must do the work. Incentives currently favor withdrawal. Another underappreciated element is how scarcity changes moral reasoning. Under abundance, generosity feels easy. Under scarcity, fairness feels paramount. Men facing tighter margins scrutinize fairness more closely. If fairness appears absent, generosity evaporates. This is not cruelty, it is survival logic. As fairness becomes central, transactional thinking increases. Transactions are evaluated explicitly. Implicit expectations are rejected. This shift makes romance harder because romance relies on ambiguity and goodwill. Without goodwill, ambiguity feels manipulative. Clear terms replace gestures. Some find this clarity refreshing, others find it cold. The long term trajectory likely involves fewer but more intentional partnerships. Those partnerships will form around shared values rather than social default. That outcome reduces volume but may increase stability for those who adapt. It does not, however, resolve the broader sense of loss experienced by those who expected a different future. Loss is an important emotion here. Many people are grieving futures they were promised but will not receive. Grief often expresses itself as anger before acceptance. Public discourse reflects this stage. Accusations mask disappointment. Moralizing masks mourning. Men, having already mourned earlier, appear emotionally ahead in the adjustment process. Women, facing newer constraints, are entering that process later. This timing mismatch exacerbates misunderstanding. Each side believes the other is acting irrationally when in fact they are at different stages of adaptation. Time will move everyone forward regardless. The question is whether movement leads to recalibration or deeper division. Recalibration requires acknowledging trade offs. Division requires clinging to absolutes. Absolutes feel safer under stress, but they limit options. One possible path forward involves redefining strength. Strength could mean adaptability rather than dominance or independence. Adaptability allows people to adjust roles without framing change as defeat. That reframing is difficult in cultures that reward rigidity. Another path involves rebuilding trust at smaller scales. Large narratives may be broken, but individual agreements can still function. People who find alignment quietly disengage from debate. Their success rarely becomes visible because it is not performative. Over time, these micro successes may influence norms indirectly, and until then, the dominant experience remains friction. Friction drains energy. Energy depletion accelerates withdrawal. The cycle continues. What is undeniable is that participation now requires justification. No one is assumed necessary. That reality is uncomfortable, but it is consistent with decades of messaging. Men accepted optionality. Optional participants choose selectively. If partnership is to recover as a common path, it must compete with solitude on quality of life, not moral obligation. It must offer peace, clarity, and mutual benefit. Without those elements, it will remain a niche choice rather than a default. The system is not broken in a dramatic way, it is simply operating according to the incentives it created. Outcomes feel shocking only because expectations lag behind reality. Reality does not negotiate with expectations. Men are not staging an exit. They are living within the framework they were told to embrace. The question is whether that framework can evolve without demanding sacrifice from one side alone. If it cannot, withdrawal will continue, quietly and persistently, reshaping culture one decision at a time. As the quiet reshaping continues, a new tension emerges that is less discussed but increasingly influential: the tension between perceived fairness and lived outcome. Fairness, in theory, is about equal treatment. In practice, people judge fairness by whether effort feels acknowledged and outcomes feel proportional. When those two elements drift apart, participation erodes even among those who still believe in cooperation. Men who once believed that fairness would eventually assert itself now see enough evidence to conclude that waiting carries too much cost. This realization shifts how men interpret social appeals. Calls for empathy, understanding, or patience are no longer heard as invitations to connect. They are heard as requests to absorb more imbalance. That interpretation may not always be intended, but perception governs response. When someone believes a pattern is unlikely to change, they stop investing in the hope that it will. At the same time, many women are confronting a different dissonance. They are being told that men's withdrawal is the problem, while their daily experience suggests that the problem is structural, is economic, and systemic. Being told that individual behavior can solve what is clearly a large scale issue feels dismissive. This breeds its own form of disengagement, not from men specifically, but from the conversation itself. When dialogue feels circular, people retreat into private coping strategies. These parallel retreats reduce the shared emotional language needed to bridge differences. Without shared language, misunderstandings harden into assumptions. Men assume women want benefits without compromise. Women assume men want comfort without responsibility. Both assumptions are incomplete, but incomplete narratives are easier to hold than complex truths under stress. Another dynamic shaping this phase is the redefinition of risk. In earlier eras, risk was associated with inaction. Failing to pursue partnership was seen as a greater danger than the potential downsides of commitment. That calculation has flipped. For many men, Commitment now feels riskier than solitude. When the direction of perceived risk reverses, behavior follows. This reversal is reinforced by visibility. Stories of negative outcomes travel faster than stories of quiet success. A stable relationship does not generate headlines. A public failure does. Over time, this skews perception. Men internalize worst case scenarios as likely outcomes. Women internalize rejection as a reflection of worth rather than environment. Both responses are understandable, but they push people further apart. Economic pressure accelerates this process by narrowing emotional bandwidth. When people are worried about rent, food, and security, their capacity for relational patience shrinks. Small frustrations feel larger. Tolerance declines. In such conditions, relationships must be exceptionally supportive to survive scrutiny. Average relationships struggle. Marginal relationships collapse quickly. One consequence of this heightened scrutiny is a shift toward pre-qualification. Men increasingly screen for compatibility before investing emotionally. They listen more closely to language around expectations, responsibility, and accountability. Women, sensing this scrutiny, may feel judged rather than chosen. The resulting defensiveness further complicates connection. The concept of compromise also undergoes reinterpretation. Compromise used to be framed as mutual adjustment. Now, it is often framed as loss. In zero sum thinking, any concession feels like defeat. This mindset makes negotiation brittle. Relationships require elasticity. Brittle systems break under pressure. Another undercurrent is the loss of shared future vision. For decades, people assumed certain milestones would occur in a predictable order: education, career, partnership, family. That sequence no longer feels guaranteed. Without a shared timeline, coordination becomes difficult. Men plan shorter horizons. Women feel time pressure without a clear path. Misalignment deepens. And there is also an identity shift underway among men that rarely gets articulated clearly. Masculine identity is increasingly defined by self governance rather than social role. Self governance prioritizes autonomy, boundaries, and internal consistency. This identity does not reject connection, but it rejects obligation without consent. That distinction matters. Obligation once defined adulthood. Consent now defines engagement. Women navigating this shift face a challenge of translation. Many expectations were built for a role based system rather than a consent based one. Translating those expectations requires intentional dialogue and humility. Humility is difficult in a climate that frames adjustment as loss of status. Status anxiety blocks adaptation. The cumulative effect is a slowdown, not a collapse, but a cooling. Fewer relationships form. Those that do form take longer to develop. Casual arrangements may increase temporarily, but long term commitments remain rare. This cooling has ripple effects across housing, consumption, and community life. Fewer households form. Demand patterns change. Social isolation increases for some, while others experience relief. The relief experienced by some men is particularly controversial because it challenges the assumption that withdrawal equals misery. Many men report lower stress, more predictable routines, and greater focus. This does not mean they never experience loneliness. It means loneliness is no longer their defining state. When solitude is manageable, urgency disappears. Urgency has always driven courtship. Remove urgency and courtship slows. Slowness favors those with patience and alignment. It disadvantages those relying on momentum or assumption. This is why calls to speed things up feel ineffective. Speed cannot substitute for incentive. Another important development is the privatization of meaning. Men increasingly locate meaning in self chosen pursuits rather than socially prescribed roles. This decentralization of meaning weakens traditional motivators like approval or conformity. When meaning is internal, external pressure loses leverage. Women whose socialization often emphasize relational meaning experience a different recalibration. Relational meaning does not disappear, but it must coexist with self support. Balancing those sources of meaning is complex, especially when external validation is unstable. This complexity adds emotional load. As emotional load increases, people simplify. Simplification often means fewer commitments. Fewer commitments mean fewer opportunities for connection. This feedback loop continues unless deliberately interrupted. The interruption, if it occurs, will likely come from necessity rather than persuasion. Economic realities may eventually force new forms of cooperation, but forced cooperation breeds resentment unless paired with renegotiated norms. Norms must reflect current conditions, not past ideals. One potential renegotiation involves redefining provision. Provision does not have to mean sole financial responsibility. It can mean reliability, planning, and shared contribution. But redefining provision requires letting go of symbolic expectations that no longer align with reality. Symbols are emotionally charged. Letting go feels like loss. Another renegotiation involves redefining attraction. Attraction shaped by performance and scarcity may give way to attraction shaped by compatibility and stability. This shift is slow because media narratives still reward spectacle. Reality, however, rewards sustainability. Men who value sustainability over spectacle are unlikely to be persuaded by displays or demands. They look for consistency. Women who value consistency must decide whether to adjust expression accordingly. Adjustment is not submission, it is strategy. But strategy requires reframing pride. Throughout this process, there is a temptation to assign villains. Villains simplify stories, but villain narratives obscure feedback loops. This situation is less about intent and more about accumulated response. Millions of small decisions interacting over time produce outcomes no one explicitly planned. The danger lies in mistaking inertia for inevitability. While habits are strong, they are not unchangeable. But change requires acknowledging trade offs honestly. It requires admitting that some promises were overstated. It requires recognizing that autonomy and interdependence must coexist. For men, that means acknowledging that complete withdrawal carries long term costs, even if short term relief is real. For women, it means acknowledging that independence without partnership has limits, especially under economic strain. Mutual acknowledgement opens space for recalibration. Denial closes it. The current climate, however, rewards denial with applause. Applause feels good, but solves nothing. Quiet adaptation solves more, but receives less recognition. Those who adapt rarely broadcast it, they simply live differently. As more people quietly adapt, public discourse becomes less representative of lived reality. Loud voices dominate, while satisfied individuals disengage. This distortion makes problems appear worse than they are in some areas and invisible in others. Policymakers and commentators respond to noise rather than signal. The signal, if one listens closely, is that people want fewer but better connections, quality over quantity, clarity over performance, peace over intensity. These preferences cut across gender but manifest differently due to social conditioning. Men are acting on these preferences by reducing participation. Women are acting on them by reassessing expectations, though often under emotional strain. The convergence point is not yet clear, but movement is occurring. Time will continue to apply pressure. Pressure reveals priorities. As priorities clarify, behaviors align. Alignment reduces friction. Whether alignment occurs across genders or within separate paths remains an open question. What is certain is that returning to previous defaults is unlikely. Defaults change when conditions change. Clinging to outdated defaults creates frustration. Updating defaults requires courage because it involves admitting that certainty was misplaced. Men have already updated many of their defaults. Women are in the process of doing so under more visible pressure. The asymmetry of timing creates a misunderstanding, but timing differences are common in social change. Eventually, the discourse will tire itself out. Fatigue leads to pragmatism. Pragmatism leads to experimentation. Experimentation leads to new norms, quietly formed and unevenly distributed. Until then, the landscape remains transitional. Men continue to conserve. Women continue to recalibrate, both navigate uncertainty with imperfect information. Mistakes will happen. Adjustments will follow. The most important takeaway is not blame, but awareness. Awareness of incentives, awareness of trade offs, awareness that peace, once found, is not easily surrendered. Men are not holding out for permission. They are living within the reality they were taught to accept. If partnership is to reemerge as a central value, it must earn its place by offering stability, respect, and shared responsibility in tangible ways. Absent that, withdrawal remains the logical outcome, not as protest, but as preference. As this long adjustment reaches its later stages, one final pattern becomes impossible to ignore, and that is normalization. What once felt shocking slowly becomes ordinary. Behaviors that were framed as extreme become mundane. Men living alone, prioritizing routine over romance, and viewing partnership as optional rather than essential no longer register as outliers. They become background. When something becomes background, it stops triggering debate and starts shaping expectations quietly. This is how social change actually locks in. And normalization matters because it reshapes how future generations interpret choice. Younger men entering adulthood do not see withdrawal as failure. They see it as one of several valid life paths. That framing removes urgency and pressure before it ever takes hold. When a path is normalized early, people do not experience opting out as loss. They experience it as selection. That distinction alters motivation permanently. At the same time, younger women entering adulthood inherit a far more complex environment than the one they were promised. They are told empowerment means choice, but they discover that choice exists within constraint. Economic pressure, demographic imbalance, and shifting male incentives narrow the field. The emotional challenge is not that choice disappeared, but that choice does not guarantee outcome. Reconciling that truth takes time. One of the quiet consequences of this normalization is the collapse of performative negotiation. Grand statements about what men should do or what women deserve lose power when the audience has already disengaged. When people stop arguing, it is not because consensus was reached, it is because relevance was lost. Relevance is the currency of influence, and influence is draining away from abstract discourse toward lived experience. Men who have structured their lives around predictability are not easily moved by appeals that promise emotional payoff without operational clarity. They want to know how a relationship will actually function day to day under real constraints. Vague assurances are no longer persuasive. Specific alignment is required. This requirement filters participation sharply. Women who adapt successfully tend to do so quietly. They reassess what partnership means in practice rather than in theory. They seek mutual contribution rather than symbolic gestures. They communicate expectations clearly and adjust timelines realistically. These women often exit the broader discourse because it no longer reflects their lived strategy. Their absence makes the discourse appear more extreme than reality. This creates a false impression that nothing is working when in fact, small pockets of recalibration are occurring beneath the noise. The issue is scale. Quiet success does not repair systemic mismatch quickly. It only demonstrates what is possible when ideology gives way to pragmatism. Another late stage effect is emotional compression. People narrow their emotional investments to avoid overload. Men invest deeply in fewer areas, women do the same. Broad emotional exposure feels risky in an unstable environment. Narrow focus feels safer. This compression reduces casual intimacy but can deepen selected bonds. The trade off is fewer connections overall. There is also a moral fatigue setting in. Years of being told how one should feel, desire, or behave erode receptivity. People become resistant to moral instruction that does not produce tangible benefit. Men, especially, have disengaged from moral arguments about duty in relationships because those arguments rarely account for lived cost. Moral fatigue makes persuasion nearly impossible without structural change. Structural change, however, lags individual adaptation. Systems move slowly. People move quickly. This gap creates frustration. But frustration does not reverse behavior. It simply marks the transition period before new norms solidify. As norms solidify, expectations recalibrate downward. This is emotionally difficult, but practically stabilizing. Lower expectations reduce disappointment. Reduced disappointment lowers conflict. Lower conflict makes limited cooperation possible again, but on narrower terms. Relationships that form under these conditions tend to be more deliberate and less performative. The idea that men will return en masse if conditions worsen misunderstands human psychology. Pressure does not automatically produce cooperation, it often produces conservation. Men have responded to pressure by simplifying, not by re engaging. That pattern has been reinforced long enough to become instinctive. Women facing mounting pressure may respond differently, but response asymmetry complicates coordination. One side seeking urgency, while the other seeks caution, creates friction. Friction without resolution leads to disengagement rather than compromise. What eventually breaks stalemates is not argument, but exhaustion. When people tire of being angry, they become practical. Practicality allows for renegotiation. Renegotiation requires admitting that previous assumptions were incomplete. That admission is uncomfortable, but it is the price of progress. Some will never make that admission. They will remain locked into narratives that preserve identity at the expense of outcome. Others will quietly adapt and move on. Social systems tend to be shaped by adapters, not by the loudest voices. As adaptation continues, partnership becomes a privilege rather than a default. It must earn its place by adding stability, not complexity. Men evaluate partnership by whether it enhances peace. Women evaluate partnership by whether it enhances security and connection. Where those evaluations align, relationships form. Where they do not, separation persists without drama. The larger society adjusts around this reality. Housing patterns change, consumption patterns change, media narratives lag and then shift. Policy struggles to keep up. None of this happens quickly, but it happens steadily. The final truth that emerges is not triumphant or tragic, it is neutral. Men were told they were optional. They accepted optionality and built lives accordingly. When optional participants leave, systems that depended on automatic participation strain. That strain forces reevaluation, but reevaluation does not guarantee restoration. Men are not angry as a group, they are resolved. Resolution is quieter than anger and far more durable. Resolution does not demand attention, it simply moves on. Women are not helpless as a group, they are adapting under constraint. Constraint accelerates learning but increases emotional cost. Some will find alignment, others will struggle longer. That divergence is not moral, it is circumstantial. The idea that men will return to previous roles out of obligation misunderstands the nature of obligation itself. Obligation follows belonging, not the other way around. Belonging cannot be demanded, it must be cultivated. Cultivation takes time and trust. Trust, once eroded, returns slowly, if at all. This is not a temporary dating trend. It is a long arc correction driven by incentives, experience, and economic reality. Corrections do not reverse cleanly, they settle into new equilibria. The equilibrium forming now includes fewer assumptions, fewer guarantees, and fewer automatic roles. It includes more caution, more selectivity, and more emphasis on peace. Whether one views that as progress or loss depends on the expectations they bring with them. What cannot be denied is that pretending nothing has changed no longer works. Men are not waiting for permission. They are not waiting for approval. They are not waiting to be convinced. They are living within the framework they were encouraged to adopt. Men are not coming to the rescue this time. And with that, shout out to the 1 hour gang for making it all the way to the end of this video. If you're enjoying these Angry Guy videos and want to show support, you can buy me a Red Bull using the link in the description. I want to know what you think about everything we discussed today, whether you agree or disagree. So leave a comment and share your thoughts. Like the video if you like it. Do not forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MWA, men walking away, and cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.